Welcome, dear friends, to a journey through 120 of the strangest, most peculiar, and downright weird facts about Pokémon, those unsettling details, biological impossibilities, behavioral oddities, and design decisions that make you wonder what Game Freak was thinking when they created creatures whose existence defies logic, whose behaviors disturb rather than charm, and whose Pokédex entries raise more questions than they answer about the bizarre world where these creatures live alongside humans who somehow accept that their reality includes physics-defying animals with supernatural powers and deeply troubling life cycles. If you enjoy this exploration of Pokemon's weirdness, please subscribe and share in the comments which weird fact disturbed or fascinated you most. I love hearing from fellow trainers about the strange corners of this franchise that we all love despite or perhaps because of its profound oddities. So settle into comfort, close your eyes whenever sleep beckons, and let us begin this gentle journey through Pokemon's weirdest facts, told soothingly despite their strangeness, like campfire stories about the inexplicable and the bizarre that make Pokémon endlessly fascinating, precisely because it refuses to make complete sense or to follow rules that normal biology or physics would demand from creatures inhabiting world that mostly resembles our own. Except for the Pokémonday Fact 1. Rhydon was the first Pokémon ever created according to Game Freak staff, making this ground and rock type the original design that preceded even Pikachu or the starter Pokémon when developers were conceptualizing what Pokémon would look like and how they would function. The choice of rhinoceros dinosaur hybrid as franchise's first creature seems arbitrary given that Rhydon never became franchise mascot or particularly prominent species, making it strange historical footnote that everything began with this specific design rather than with creatures that would become more iconic and more central to Pokemon's identity in ways that Rhydon never achieved despite being literally first. Fact 2. Pokemon can shrink themselves to fit inside Pokeballs through unknown mechanism that games never explain beyond showing transformation into energy or into miniaturized form during capture animations that don't clarify whether Pokemon become energy, become compressed matter, or undergo some other process, allowing creatures weighing hundreds of pounds to fit inside palm-sized spheres. The mass has to go somewhere according to physics, but Pokémon ignores conservation of mass, making it unclear whether Pokeballs store matter in compressed form, convert it to energy, or transport it to pocket dimension, where Pokémon exist comfortably until released back into normal space at full size. Fact 3. Slowpoke evolves into Slowbro when Shelder bites its tail, creating permanent symbiotic relationship, but the Shelder's appearance changes dramatically from its normal form into spiral shell that doesn't resemble regular Shelder at all. This suggests that biting Slowpoke's tail triggers Shelder's own transformation into unrecognizable form, or that the Shelder isn't actually Shelder but is growth that Slowpoke produces when evolving that happens to resemble and be called Shelder despite not being separate organism. Either interpretation raises questions about evolution mechanics and about what actually happens during this bizarre two-species transformation. Fact 4. Cubone wears its dead mother's skull according to Pokédex entries, but this creates logical problem because Cubone's mother would be Marowak, whose skull doesn't fit Cubone's head shape, and because every Cubone wears skull, suggesting that all Cubone mothers die immediately after birth, creating species that apparently cannot sustain stable population through normal reproduction. when all mothers die, leaving only orphaned babies who somehow survive to adulthood despite having no parents to raise them or teach them survival skills that young Pokemon logically would need. Fact 5. Grimer and muck formed from sludge exposed to X-rays from the moon, according to some Pokédex entries, creating pollution Pokemon through lunar radiation, mutating industrial waste into living creatures. This origin story raises questions about whether moon in Pokemon world emits radiation that our moon doesn't, whether X-rays can actually create life from non-living matter, and why this supposedly common occurrence that created species only happened once, creating Grimer line rather than continuously generating new pollution, Pokemon from waste that moon constantly irradiates, if this mechanism actually functions as described. Fact 6. Voltorb looks identical to Pokeballs and supposedly formed when Pokeballs were exposed to energy pulses, creating living versions of human technology. But this origin story was retroactively contradicted when Pokemon Legends Arceus featured Voltorb existing in ancient Hisui before modern Pokeballs were invented. The contradiction suggests either that Voltorb's origin story was false, or that time travel or alternative explanations exist for how Voltorb existed before the technology it supposedly formed from, creating timeline inconsistency that games don't address or explain beyond just showing Voltorb existing when it supposedly shouldn't. Fact 7. Ditto can transform into any Pokemon, perfectly copying appearance and moves, and fan theories suggest Ditto is failed Mew clone due to both being pink, both weighing same amount, both learning transform naturally, and both being able to breed with any species. Game Freak never confirmed this theory, but evidence is compelling enough that fans widely accept it as likely explanation for Ditto's bizarre properties, including its cellular instability and its unique breeding compatibility, suggesting artificial origin rather than natural evolution, creating species with Ditto's unusual characteristics. Fact 8. Kangaskhan is born with baby already in pouch, according to games that show baby present when Kangaskhan hatches from egg, creating impossibility where newborn immediately has offspring of its own without ever having reproduced. This suggests either that Kangaskhan eggs contain two individuals, or that baby isn't actually offspring, but is part of parent's body despite appearing to be separate organism, or that Pokemon reproduction works differently than games suggest when showing eggs hatching into creatures that shouldn't yet have babies if normal reproduction applied to this species. Fact 9. Magcargo's body temperature is 18,000 degrees Fahrenheit according to Pokédex, entries hotter than sun's surface, which is approximately 10,000 degrees, creating impossibility where being near Magcargo would instantly vaporize trainer and everything nearby through radiating heat that nothing could withstand at distances where battling would occur. The temperature is physically impossible for creature moving around on Earth without igniting atmosphere and creating catastrophic fires, suggesting either that Pokédex entries are wildly exaggerated or that Pokémon physics operates completely differently from real physics in ways that allow impossible temperatures without expected consequences. Fact is, Gardevoir can create small black holes according to Pokédex entries describing its protective abilities, but black holes would destroy planet through gravitational collapse, making this power catastrophically dangerous rather than protective as entries describe. The casual mention of black hole creation without acknowledging that this would end all life suggests either hyperbole in Pokédex descriptions or that Pokémon World's physics allows stable miniature black holes that don't behave like real black holes whose gravity would be inescapable and whose presence would devastate everything nearby through tidal forces and gravitational forces, effects that wouldn't distinguish between threats and innocence. Fact 11. Kadabra supposedly was human child with psychic powers who transformed into Pokemon after waking one morning, having spontaneously metamorphosed during sleep, creating horrifying scenario where person loses humanity, becoming creature whose intelligence might retain human memories but whose form prevents returning to human life or human society. The entry doesn't specify whether transformation was reversible or whether consciousness survived intact, making unclear whether Kadabra species consists of transformed humans or whether single child transformed becoming unique case, though entries suggest its origin story for entire species, implying multiple humans became Kadabra through similar transformations. Fact 12. Parasect is controlled by mushroom growing from its back with bug host essentially dead, according to Pokédex entries describing how mushroom overtook Parasect's brain and now controls body as zombie puppet. The entries explicitly state that mushroom is in control and that bug is dead or brain dead, making Parasect technically fungus, using insect corpse as vehicle for mobility and for spreading spores, creating disturbing reality where trainers command dead creatures whose consciousness was replaced by parasitic mushroom that puppets corpse around while searching for new hosts to infect continuing parasitic life cycle. Fact 13. Yamask carries mask that was its face when it was human, and entries describe it crying while looking at mask, remembering its human life, creating tragic existence, where spirits of deceased humans become Pokémon, who retain memories of living as humans while being trapped in ghostly forms that cannot return to human existence. The implications suggest that death in Pokémon world doesn't lead to afterlife, but instead transforms deceased into ghost-type Pokémon, who continue existing in liminal state between life and death, remembering what they lost while being unable to reclaim human identity that death stole from them. Fact 14. Drifloon attempts to kidnap children by grabbing hands and floating away with them. Though weak, pulling strength means only very small children are endangered, according to entries that describe this balloon, Pokemon's sinister behavior. The entries state that Drifloon is formed from souls of deceased people, and Pokemon making these balloon creatures literally spirits of dead beings who kidnap children for unknown purposes that entries don't specify but which probably aren't benevolent, given that kidnapping children seems hostile act rather than protective behavior that charitable interpretation might suggest. Fact 15. Espurr constantly uses psychic power to restrain its own psychic energy that would otherwise leak out, destroying everything nearby, creating existence where this small, cute Pokemon lives in constant effort to contain power that would devastate surroundings if control ever slipped. The organs on its ears serve as restraints containing power that would obliterate everything within 300 feet if released, meaning that every Espurr is perpetually maintaining concentration, preventing catastrophic psychic explosion that would occur if it ever relaxed or if restraints failed through damage or exhaustion. Fact 16. Shedinja appears when Nincada evolves into Ninjask, if trainer has empty party slot and spare Pokeball, with Shedinja being discarded exoskeleton that somehow gained independent life and consciousness separate from Ninjask, who emerged from shell. The entries warn that looking into hole in Shedinja's back causes souls to be stolen, creating dangerous Pokémon whose hollow interior contains something that steals souls from observers who make mistake of looking directly at opening, where Ninjask exited, leaving void that consumes souls, filling emptiness that Shedinja's lack of internal organs creates. Fact 17. Frostlass freezes men it finds attractive, then displays frozen corpses as decorations in its lair, according to Pokédex entries, describing this ice and ghost type's disturbing collection habits. The entries specify that Frostlass is spirit of woman who died on snowy mountain, suggesting that female spirit's loneliness in death drives it to collect frozen men whose bodies become permanent companions that cannot leave or reject. Frostlass the way living men might abandon someone who died alone in frozen wilderness, becoming ghost that collects substitutes for companionship that death denied it. Fact 18. Gorbis drains body fluids from prey using thin mouth, leaving dried husks according to entries describing this water type's feeding habits that resemble vampire attacks more than normal predation. The pretty pink appearance conceals brutal feeding method that kills prey through exsanguination, creating contrast between elegant design and horrifying behavior that entries describe as if it's normal predation rather than acknowledging that draining all fluids from prey's body seems excessively cruel compared to how most predators kill relatively quickly, rather than slowly draining life through extended feeding sessions. Fact 19. Spoink dies if it stops bouncing, according to Pokédex entries, claiming that its heart only functions while bouncing continuously, creating exhausting existence where this psychic type can never rest without dying. The biological mechanism isn't explained, leaving unclear how bounce-dependent heart function would evolve, or how Spoink could ever sleep without dying, though entries don't address these obvious questions about how species that dies if it stops moving could possibly survive or maintain stable population when any injury preventing bouncing would be instantly fatal, regardless of medical intervention. Fact 20. Banette was stuffed toy that came to life through grudge after being thrown away by child who owned it, gaining sentience through resentment and hate rather than through natural reproduction. The entries describe Banette searching for child who abandoned it, planning revenge through curses that Banette generates by sticking needles into its own zipper mouth, creating voodoo doll effect where harming itself curses targets of its hatred, suggesting that this ghost type exists purely for revenge against child whose crime was discarding toy without realizing that discarded objects could become living creatures motivated entirely by desire for vengeance. Fact 21. Cacturn stalks travelers through deserts at night, following them until they collapse from exhaustion, at which point Cacturn supposedly drains their blood according to entries describing patient predatory behavior. The entries don't specify whether Cacturne only targets dying travelers or whether it deliberately causes exhaustion through persistent following that psychologically wears down victims who realize they're being stalked by barely visible cactus, maintaining pursuit regardless of how far or how fast victims attempt to flee through inhospitable desert, where Cacturn has advantage through adaptation to environment that humans cannot survive without, resources that desert crossing depletes. Fact 22. Litwick pretends to guide people with its light but actually drains their life force, becoming brighter as victims weaken and approach death, according to entries describing this ghost and fire type's deceptive hunting strategy. The entries note that hospitals refuse to allow Litwick inside because they illuminate brightly near dying patients, essentially serving as death omens, whose bright flames indicate that victims have little life force remaining for Litwick to drain before victims expire from supernatural energy theft that Litwick commits while pretending to provide helpful illumination that victims desperately follow without realizing they're being led toward death. Fact 23. Mewtwo was created as artificial Pokémon through genetic engineering that scientists performed attempting to clone Mew, but which created new species rather than perfect copy, with Mewtwo's intelligence and power exceeding intentions, leading to laboratory destruction and researcher deaths when experiment escaped. The Pokémon Mansion journals describe project's progression and abrupt ending, suggesting that scientists died as consequence of their hubris in creating life, without considering whether created beings would accept purposes that creators assigned them, or whether artificial intelligence would rebel against servitude that creation implied, regardless of whether Mewtwo was explicitly designed for combat or research applications. Fact 24. Claydol floats through air using psychic power and sleeps while floating, but it also supposedly sleeps while standing, making unclear which sleep method is accurate or whether Claydol alternates between floating sleep and standing sleep for unknown reasons. More disturbingly, entries claim that Claydol is ancient clay doll that came to life approximately 20,000 years ago through exposure to mysterious ray, creating creature that has existed for millennia, predating human civilization and potentially predating most modern Pokémon species, whose evolution occurred after Claydol already existed as animate construct created through unknown radiation source. Fact Vinksank. Mimikyu's true form is so horrifying that scholar who saw it died from shock, according to entries about this ghost and fairy type who wears Pikachu costume to hide appearance because its real body is too terrible for humans to witness safely. The entries describe Mimikyu's disguise occasionally breaking, revealing glimpses of true form that cause illness or terror in observers, though exactly what lies beneath costume remains mystery, making Mimikyu's actual appearance something that imagination makes worse than any specific description could achieve, creating Pokémon whose identity is defined entirely by refusing to show what it actually looks like. Fact 26. Xurkitree absorbs electricity and spreads throughout areas like invasive plant species that Ultra Beast entries describe as inserting roots into ground and draining power from electrical infrastructure. The entries don't clarify whether Xurkitree is plant, electrical being, or something else entirely, with its body appearing to be bundle of cables or wires, animated through unknown means, creating organism whose biology doesn't resemble anything from normal reality, making it genuinely alien creature whose anatomy and life cycle don't map onto any earthly categories that Pokémon usually resembles, despite being fantastical versions of normal animals. Fact 27. Beware's hugs are deadly, with entries warning that this normal and fighting types' affectionate embraces can snap spines or crush ribs through excessive strength that Beware cannot properly control, making its friendly behavior potentially fatal to humans and smaller Pokémon who receive hugs that would kill them, despite Beware intending affection rather than harm. The entries describe Beware waving arms to make friends, but trainers are warned to run away if Beware approaches, because greeting that appears friendly will result in death through crushing hug that Beware doesn't realize is fatal to fragile beings whose bodies cannot withstand embrace from creature whose strength exceeds its understanding of others' physical limitations. Fact 28. Palossand controls adults to build its castle body, with victims becoming trapped in sand, unable to escape, as Palossand drains their life force until they die, buried inside its structure, according to entries describing how this ghost and ground-type sandcastle Pokémon grows through consuming those who touch it. The entries describe bones of victims buried within Palossand's body, suggesting that this Pokémon doesn't just drain life force but actually kills and absorbs victims whose remains become part of sandcastle that lures more the victims to touch it, becoming trapped, experiencing same fate as previous victims who tried to build or interact with cursed sand structure. Fact 29. Wailord is lighter than air, based on its size and weight, creating impossible density where 4 7-foot-long Pokémon weighing 877 pounds would float like balloon due to having lower density than hydrogen gas. The physics don't work, making Wailord physically impossible unless its body contains vacuum or unless it generates anti-gravity through means that entries don't describe, though game mechanics treat it as normal water type that can use surf and dive, despite being blimp that should float into stratosphere rather than swimming in ocean where its buoyancy would make remaining underwater impossible without constant downward propulsion, fighting against tendency to bob to surface and continue rising through atmosphere. Fact 30. Gardevoir can sense future and will protect trainer, even at cost of its own life. According to entries describing this psychic and fairy type's loyalty, but future sight creates paradoxes, where Gardevoir knows outcomes before they occur, potentially allowing prevention of foreseen disasters unless future is predetermined and immutable. The entries state Gardevoir will create small black holes to protect trainer without clarifying how it reconciles foreknowledge with action, whether it sees all possible futures or single inevitable timeline, or how precognition works when quantum mechanics suggests multiple potential outcomes rather than single determined future that clairvoyance implies exists. Fact 31. Phantump are created when spirits of children who died lost in forests possess tree stumps, according to entries describing another instance where deceased children become ghost-type Pokémon haunting locations, where they perished. The entries specify that Phantump make eerie sounds, resembling crying children attempting to lead people astray in forests, suggesting that these child spirits either seek company through making others lost or resent living people surviving, where they perished, though motivation remains unclear, beyond establishing that dead children's spirits don't rest peacefully, but instead become Pokémon that haunt forests, potentially harming others who enter woods where Phantump dwell. Fact 32. Trubbish and Garbodor formed from garbage bags containing industrial waste that somehow became living Pokémon through unknown process that entries don't adequately explain beyond stating that garbage became alive. The origin differs from Grimer's lunar radiation story without providing alternative explanation for how non-living trash achieved sentience and mobility, leaving unclear what mechanism transforms waste into Pokémon, and whether process continues generating new Trubbish from garbage, or whether original population reproduces biologically, despite being animated trash whose reproduction mechanics seem impossible, given that they're literally garbage that achieved life through unexplained means. Fact 33. Chandelure's flames burn spirits rather than bodies, according to entries, with victims dying mysteriously without physical injuries when Chandelure's flames touch them, consuming souls while leaving physical forms intact. The entries describe Chandelure lurking around hospitals waiting for people to die so it can absorb departing souls at moment of death, creating vulture-like behavior where this ghost and fire type preys on dying rather than on living, consuming spiritual essence at point when soul leaves body, creating deaths that medical examiners cannot explain because bodies show no cause of death beyond having been drained of spirit that Chandelure consumed. Fact 34. Hypno allegedly kidnaps children after hypnotizing them, according to Pokédex entries that were toned down in later generations after parents complained about Pokémon describing child abduction. Original entries described missing children last seen with Hypno, suggesting that this psychic type's appetite for dreams drives it to capture children who provide continuous dream supply rather than just feeding briefly on sleeping victims before moving on, creating implied horror where Hypno keeps kidnapped children for prolonged periods, harvesting their dreams, or worse outcomes that entries don't specify, but which disappearances of children taken by Hypno suggest aren't benevolent outcomes for victims. Fact 35. Dusknoir receives transmissions from spirit world through antenna on its head and uses these communications to guide lost spirits to afterlife, but entries also suggest it captures spirits in its body through stomach, mouth, that opens to dimension or to void where absorbed beings disappear. The dual description creates ambiguity about whether Dusknoir is helpful psychopomp, guiding souls to proper rest, or is predatory entity consuming spirits for nourishment while claiming to provide guidance, making uncertain whether spirits that Dusknoir interacts with receive genuine assistance reaching afterlife, or whether they're being consumed by creature that uses helpful reputation as cover for predatory feeding on ghosts. Fact 36. Vanillite line is ice that achieved life rather than being ice-type creature, with entries describing how these Pokémon formed from icicles that gained sentience through unknown process, creating living ice rather than creatures who control ice or who have icy characteristics. The biological mechanism is impossible through normal physics, leaving unexplained how ice becomes alive and why living ice would maintain frozen form while existing in environments where normal ice would melt, whether vanillity can melt and reform or whether melting kills it permanently, and how ice without brain or organs achieves consciousness without biological substrate that consciousness traditionally requires for emerging from neural activity. Fact 37. Cofagrigus was human who died and was mummified before becoming ghost type that carries coffin as part of its body, with entries describing it pretending to be fancy coffin to lure grave robbers close, before wrapping them in 4 shadowy arms, transforming them into mummies that become part of Cofagrigus' collection. The entries suggest that Cofagrigus adds victims' mummified remains to decorations, adorning its coffin form, creating Pokémon that grows more elaborate through killing and mummifying treasure hunters who investigate tombs, where Cofagrigus dwells waiting to punish those who disturb ancient graves that these ghost types inhabit or protect from looters who don't realize fancy coffins are actually hostile Pokémonde. Fact 38. Komala spends entire life asleep, including eating, fighting, and breeding while dreaming, never waking from birth to death, according to entries describing this normal type's perpetual slumber. The biology is impossible without explaining how Komala functions while unconscious, how it avoids predation while sleeping, how it finds food while dreaming, or how it reproduces while never waking, creating creature whose existence violates basic survival requirements that consciousness normally provides, through allowing organisms to respond to environment rather than sleeping through all experiences, including ones that would require awareness for navigation or self-preservation. Fact 39. Oranguru creates tools and potions from forest materials using intelligence that rivals or exceeds human cognition, with entries suggesting that these psychic and normal types live in forests where they spend time thinking deeply about life's mysteries. The description of near-human or superhuman intelligence in wild Pokémon raises questions about why Oranguru remain in forests rather than forming civilizations, whether they're content with simple existence despite possessing intelligence for building societies, or whether they deliberately choose different lifestyle than humans pursue, using intelligence for contemplation rather than for technology and expansion that human intelligence produced historically. Fact 40. Sandygast controls anyone who places hand on its shovel, forcing them to gather sand that Sandygast uses to grow larger, with entries describing children being controlled and forced to build Sandygast's body, even as their energy drains away, feeding Pokémon that manipulates them. The control is absolute, with victims unable to resist compulsion to build sandcastle, even while being drained of life force through contact with cursed shovel that they cannot release until Sandygast is satisfied or until victims collapse. From exhaustion, creating scenario where innocent children playing on beach encounter possessed shovel that transforms them into unwilling servants building their own destroyer's body until intervention saves them or until Sandygast completes growth. And so concludes the first part of our journey through weird Pokémon facts, having explored biological impossibilities like Magcargo's impossible temperature, disturbing behaviors like Drifloon's child kidnapping, existence questions like whether Kadabra are transformed humans, and dark implications like Parasect being dead bug controlled by parasitic fungus. Rest now if sleep calls, or continue to part 2 where we'll discover more bizarre Pokédex entries, more creatures whose existence defies explanation, and more strangeness that makes Pokémon endlessly fascinating through refusing to make complete sense according to our reality's rules. Sleep gently, dear friends. Welcome back, dear friends, to our continuing exploration of Pokémon's strangest facts. In this second part, we'll delve deeper into the paradoxes that Pokémon biology creates, examine the impossible physics that these creatures casually violate, uncover more disturbing implications hidden in seemingly innocent Pokédex entries, discover bizarre evolutionary relationships that make no biological sense, and explore the weird interactions between Pokémon and humans that raise uncomfortable questions about consciousness, consent, and the ethics of a world where sentient creatures are captured and commanded to fight. So settle back comfortably, close your eyes when sleep beckons, and let us continue this gentle journey through weirdness that makes Pokémon simultaneously beloved and baffling. Fact 41. Lopunny's design was intentionally made to be attractive to humans, according to interviews with designers, creating uncomfortable situation where Pokémon that trainers capture and command was deliberately designed with human-appealing features that blur lines between animal companion and something else. The human-like proportions, the clothing-like fur, and the overall aesthetic raised concerns from critics who argued that designing Pokémon with sexual characteristics was inappropriate for franchise aimed at children, though Game Freak maintained that design was simply meant to be elegant and appealing without intending interpretations that some players projected onto creature that was meant to be rabbit-like, normal type, without implications that its design occasionally generated. Fact 42. Slowking gained superintelligence when Shelder bit its head, injecting toxins that stimulated brain function, creating situation where poison from biting creature actually enhanced cognition rather than causing harm. The entries describe Slowking as highly intelligent Pokémon capable of human speech and complex reasoning that Slowpoke lacked before evolution occurred through Shelder bite, suggesting that symbiotic relationship with shell-dwelling Pokémon provides cognitive enhancement through biochemical changes that Shelder venom causes in Slowpoke brain tissue, creating intelligence boost as side effect of what should be harmful toxin injection into cranium. Fact 43. Mr. Mime creates invisible walls through pantomiming, with solidified air barriers being real enough to stop attacks and to provide actual protection, despite being created through gestures without physical material being manipulated. The entries describe these barriers as hardened air that forms through Mr. Mime's pantomime gestures, suggesting either that psychic power manifests through theatrical performance or that belief and intention can create physical effects through willpower alone, making mime actions into reality warping techniques that shouldn't function according to physics, but which work because Pokémon World allows thought and gesture to create tangible effects that normal reality doesn't permit. Fact 44. Trevenant can control trees throughout forest using its roots, creating army of animated plants that attack anyone who harms woodland ecosystem that Trevenant protects. The entries describe people becoming lost in forests and dying from exposure or starvation when Trevenant traps them, using controlled trees that prevent escape as punishment for environmental damage that victims caused or might cause if allowed to leave forest alive. The implication is that Trevenant deliberately kills humans through indirect means, using controlled environment as weapon against those deemed threats to forest, creating judge, jury, executioner scenario where single Pokémon determines who deserves death for ecological crimes. Fact 45. Lantern's light can illuminate depths of ocean that sunlight cannot reach, with entries claiming its bioluminescence is visible from 5 miles away, creating light source powerful enough to be seen across massive distances underwater, where visibility is normally measured in feet rather than miles. The energy requirements for producing light that bright would be enormous, requiring power source that small fish Pokémon shouldn't possess unless biological processes in Pokémon World are radically more efficient than real biochemistry allows, or unless Lantern draws energy from unknown sources beyond just metabolism of consumed food that couldn't provide sufficient energy for sustaining light intensity that entries describe. Fact 46. Diglett's body beneath ground has never been shown in main series games despite decades of speculation about what lower half looks like, creating ongoing mystery about whether Diglett has legs, tentacles, long body, or something else entirely beneath soil surface where it remains hidden from observation. The anime and spin-off games have occasionally shown Diglett's lower half, but depictions vary and aren't considered canonical, leaving official appearance of Diglett's underground portion unknown after nearly 30 years since species debuted, making this one of franchise's most enduring mysteries about basic anatomical question that most Pokémon have obvious answers for. Fact 47. Deoxys's DNA mutated after virus from space was exposed to laser beam creating alien Pokémon, whose origin involves extraterrestrial microorganism transforming through human technology into sentient creature capable of changing forms. The highly specific origin story, virus from space plus laser equals intelligent, shape-shifting alien, seems arbitrary, making it unclear why this particular combination would produce deoxys rather than just killing virus or creating different range mutation, though entries treat this as straightforward explanation without acknowledging how improbable it is that space virus plus laser would produce intelligent life, rather than any of countless alternative outcomes that such interaction might generate. Fact 48. Absol appears before disasters attempting to warn people, but was historically blamed for causing catastrophes it predicted, leading to persecution of species whose only crime was trying to help humans avoid dangers it sensed coming. The tragedy of Absol being hunted for trying to warn people creates question about why it continues attempting to help humans, despite being hunted for warnings that people misinterpreted as curses, whether Absol's nature compels warning behavior regardless of consequences, or whether individual Absol hope that someday humans will understand that disaster predictions aren't disaster, causation that scared people attributed to messenger rather than to actual causes. Fact 49. Execute is group of 6 eggs that function as single organism, but they're not actually eggs, but are seed-like entities that resemble eggs while being botanical rather than animal in nature despite being classified as grass type. The entries describe broken egg, showing interior that looks like seed, confirming that egg appearance is misleading. But why plant seeds would evolve to look like eggs remains unexplained beyond creating confusion about what execute actually is when appearance, classification, and description all provide conflicting information about whether these are eggs, seeds, or something else that resembles both without being either. Fact 50. Klefki collects keys through attraction to metal objects that it gathers compulsively, with entries suggesting that people who lose keys often discover that Klefki stole them for its collection. The steel and fairy type's key collecting behavior creates nuisance where missing keys aren't just lost but were taken by Pokémon, whose hoarding instinct causes problems for humans whose locks cannot be opened without keys that Klefki acquired, though entries don't describe what Klefki does with collected keys beyond accumulating them, suggesting that collecting serves no practical purpose beyond satisfying compulsion to gather metal objects for collection that grows as Klefki continues stealing keys from unsuspecting victims. Fact 51. Aromatese's scent can be controlled to produce smells ranging from pleasant fragrances to stenches so foul they make enemies faint, creating fairy type, whose primary weapon is biochemical warfare through odors. The entries describe medieval nobles keeping aromatese as companions who provided pleasant smells, masking unwashed bodies and poor sanitation of historical periods before modern hygiene, but don't address whether aromatese consented to being kept for humans' olfactory benefit or whether these Pokémon were essentially enslaved for providing perfume services that nobility demanded, without considering that sentient creatures might not want to spend lives producing pleasant smells for other species' comfort. Fact 52. Salazzle creates reverse harem of male Salandit, who serve her exclusively due to pheromones she emits that keep males under her control, with male Salandit being unable to evolve, remaining subservient to female who uses them for protection and food gathering. The entries describe this as natural behavior, but implications of mind control through pheromones, creating permanent servitude, raise questions about consent and autonomy when male Salandit apparently have no choice except obedience to female whose chemical signals override their will, making them servants whose loyalty isn't choice but is biochemical compulsion that they cannot resist regardless of personal preferences. Fact 53. Porygon is artificial. Pokemon created entirely through computer programming that somehow achieved ability to enter cyberspace and to exist as digital entity that can also manifest in physical reality. The mechanism allowing computer program to become physical creature isn't explained, making unclear how software achieves matter existence or whether Porygon is hologram, hard light construct, or something else that allows digital information to interact with physical world through means that shouldn't be possible when programs are abstract data rather than tangible entities that can be touched, captured in Pokeballs, or defeated in battles with physical creatures. Fact 54. Zygarde exists as distributed organism with cells scattered throughout Kalos that can combine into various forms depending on how many cells gather together, creating Pokemon whose body isn't unified organism but is collection of potentially hundreds of individual cells that function collectively. The entries describe cells lacking consciousness individually but achieving awareness when sufficient numbers congregate into 10% form, 50% form, or complete form, creating emergence, where quantity of simple units produces complex consciousness that components individually lack, making Zygarde example of hive mind or distributed intelligence that philosophical questions about identity and consciousness complicate when asking whether Zygarde is one being or many. Fact 55. Wishy-washy school form is created when individual weak wishy-washy reach sufficient numbers to form school that appears as single massive fish, creating situation where dozens or hundreds of individuals combine into collective that battles as unit before dispersing when health drops below threshold. The entries describe individual wishy-washy being extremely weak, earning classification as weakest Pokemon, but school form is formidable through combined strength that numbers provide, creating dramatic power. Difference between solo specimen and coordinated group, whose cooperation transforms vulnerability into strength that allows predation on threats that would easily defeat individual wishy-washy fighting alone. Fact 56. Mimikyu breaks into jealous rage when its disguise is damaged, with violent behavior emerging from normally shy Pokemon whose attachment to Pikachu costume leads to aggressive defense of disguise that serves as Mimikyu's only protection against world that finds its true form intolerable. The entries describe Mimikyu attacking anyone who damages disguise, suggesting that costume isn't just clothing but is integral to Mimikyu's identity and psychological well-being, with damage to disguise potentially threatening mental stability of creature that depends on hiding true form from world that rejected it, creating understandable but concerning behavior where property damage triggers violent response that victims might not survive. Fact 57. Durant and Heatmore exist in predator-prey relationship with Steel, and Bug-type Durant being primary food source for Fire-type Heatmore, whose flame tongue melts Durant's steel armor, allowing consumption of insect inside. The entries describe Durant colonies organizing defensive formations, attempting to repel Heatmore attacks, but which often fail when flame defeats steel, leaving colonies devastated by predation that Durant cannot prevent, despite numerical plane advantage that should favor prey over predator, if not for type advantage that makes Heatmore perfectly evolved for hunting. Specifically Durant, whose existence as species depends on reproducing faster than Heatmore can consume them. Fact 58. Cryogonal is ice crystal that gained life through being born from ice clouds during winter, existing as sentient ice formation rather than as creature made of ice, creating distinction where cryogonal is ice, rather than being creature who possesses icy characteristics. The entries describe it chaining together other ice crystals to create larger body, but when temperatures rise and ice melts, cryogonal presumably dies or disperses, though entries don't clarify whether consciousness survives melting or whether cryogonal's awareness is destroyed when physical form melts, leaving unclear whether seasonal melting is dormancy or is death that occurs annually when warm weather arrives, killing ice beings who cannot maintain frozen structure. Fact 59. Slaking's ability, truant forces it to rest every other turn, making this normal type nearly useless in battle, despite having base stat total of 670 equal to many restricted legendary Pokémon, because inability to act 50% of time negates statistical advantages that should make it dominant force. The intentional crippling through ability design creates Pokémon that is simultaneously incredibly powerful and competitively worthless, demonstrating how single ability can completely determine viability regardless of stats that would indicate threatening Pokémon, if not for truant, preventing it from acting frequently enough to capitalize on power that impressive attack and HP stats should provide. Fact 60. Tyranitar's rampage causes mountains to crumble and maps to be redrawn, according to entries describing this rock and dark type's destructive power that reshapes geography through tantrums, with cavern collapse and avalanches being routine consequences of Tyranitar's passage through mountainous areas. The casual environmental destruction raises questions about how Tyranitar populations are controlled when they can destroy infrastructure and alter terrain through normal behavior without needing to be particularly aggressive, simply existing as creatures whose movement devastates surroundings, making areas where Tyranitar live extremely dangerous for humans whose settlements cannot withstand geological disruption that these Pokémon cause accidentally. Fact 61. Malamar has intelligence rivaling humans and can force others to obey using hypnotic patterns on its body, with entries speculating that if multiple Malamar coordinated, they could take over the world through mind control capabilities that individual specimens possess, but which haven't been organized into conquest because Malamar remain solitary. The threat of superintelligent telepathic squid using hypnosis for world domination seems absurd, but entries treat it as serious possibility worth warning about, suggesting that Pokémon World recognizes risks that Malamar present if they ever organize into groups, pursuing goals beyond individual survival, making them potential existential threat, despite being catchable Pokémon that trainers command without apparent difficulty. Fact 62. Kommo-o's scales produce beautiful ringing sounds when struck in battle, but entries also describe the scales being shed periodically and used by ancient warriors for crafting weapons and armor, creating economy where Pokémon body parts were harvested for equipment. The description of humans using Pokémon remains for tools raises questions about ethics of using shed scales versus killing Pokémon for parts, whether Kommo-o consent to scale harvesting, and how common practice was in ancient times. That entries describe when humans apparently integrated Pokémon remains into crafting without concerns that modern sensibilities might raise about using sentient creatures' bodies as raw materials. Fact 63. Sawk and Thrall train constantly seeking to master fighting techniques, with entries describing them wearing gis, martial arts uniforms, that grow naturally as part of their bodies rather than being clothing that they put on. The biological clothing raises questions about how fabric-like material grows from fighting-type skin and whether it's fur that resembles cloth, actual textile that somehow grows organically, or something else that appears to be gi without being removable garments, making unclear whether Sock and Thrall are naked with cloth-like fur or are perpetually clothed in biological garments that their bodies produce through unknown mechanisms. Fact 64. Poniard and Bisharp are steel and dark types, whose bodies are covered in blades, with entries describing how dull blades bring shame, requiring Poniard to sharpen bodies against river stones, maintaining edges that serve as weapons and as source of pride. The biological blades create maintenance requirements, where Pokémon must constantly sharpen bodies to maintain effectiveness and dignity, with dull blades indicating either old age or insufficient dedication to sharpening, creating social stigma that entries describe as shameful condition that Poniard cannot tolerate without feeling dishonored through having inadequately maintained weaponized bodies that define their identity and worth. Fact 65. Delmise is ghost, inhabiting seaweed and anchor, rather than being the seaweed or anchor itself, creating possessed objects. Scenario where spirit uses collected detritus as body after death, left it without physical form. The entries describe ships sinking after Delmise latches onto them, draining life force from crew before. Vessel founders, leaving Delmise to collect wreckage from ships it destroyed, suggesting that this ghost and grass type deliberately causes shipwrecks for harvesting energy and materials, rather than just haunting existing wrecks, making it active threat to maritime travel rather than passive spirit dwelling in. Ruins of vessels that other causes destroyed. Fact 66. Wailord can breed with Skitty, despite massive size difference, creating offspring through mechanics that biology shouldn't allow when 47-foot whale-like Pokémon mates with 2-foot cat-like Pokémonday. The breeding compatibility group system allows this pairing because both are in field egg group, but practical impossibility of physical reproduction between such disparate sizes is never addressed, leaving implications uncomfortable when considering how breeding actually occurs between Pokémon whose size differences should make reproduction mechanically impossible unless Pokémon reproduction works completely differently than entries describing eggs would suggest when they don't explain how eggs appear or what breeding actually involves beyond game mechanic where Daycare Man finds egg without explaining how. Fact 67. Golurk was designed as guardian to protect ancient cities, but now wanders aimlessly because cities it protected have been destroyed or abandoned, leaving Golurk without purpose, following programming from creators who died millennia ago. The entries describe Golurk continuing to follow instructions, despite cities no longer existing to defend, creating tragic figure whose loyalty outlasted civilization that built it, and whose existence consists of protecting locations that have crumbled to ruins where no living things remain, requiring defense that Golurk provides to empty ruins, unable to update programming that binds it to protecting places that time erased, leaving Guardian with mission but no beneficiaries. Fact 68. Eternatus came from space and poisoned Galar region, causing Dynamax phenomenon through energy leaking from its body, with entries describing how crash landing 20,000 years ago contaminated entire region with radiation that causes size changes. The entries suggest that Eternatus is fundamentally incompatible with normal dimension, and that its mere presence poisons reality, causing mutations and distortions that affect all Pokémon in contaminated area, making Eternatus not just powerful but existentially dangerous through passive environmental corruption that it cannot control or prevent from affecting surroundings, that its alien biology contaminates through existing in dimension that cannot safely contain its extraterrestrial nature. Fact 69. Aegislash's shield form can control those who try to command it as king, with entries describing ancient monarchs being controlled by possessed shield that commanded them rather than being tools that kings wielded. The entries suggest that some historical rulers were puppets for sentient weapons that used them to pursue shield's own goals, while kings believed they held power, not realizing that Aegislash controlled their actions, making them figureheads for weapons agendas. This raises questions about how many historical events were influenced by possessed armaments whose intelligence and goals shaped politics through manipulating monarchs who trusted weapons without realizing weapons had agency. Fact 70. Spiritomb was formed when 108 spirits were bound to Odd Keystone as punishment for misdeeds 500 years ago, creating imprisoned collective that remains confined unless Keystone is disturbed. The entries describe Spiritomb as extremely vicious despite imprisonment, suggesting that 5 centuries of confinement haven't diminished anger that caused original punishment or reformed spirits, who apparently remain dangerous and hateful after half millennium, trapped in stone, creating question about whether eternal imprisonment is ethical, even for spirits who committed crimes that warranted binding them together in keystone that prevents individual identity, while forcing collective consciousness that 108 separate beings share without consent or escape. Fact 71. Crabominable evolves from Crabrawler only when leveled at Mount Lanakeela's summit, creating evolution that requires traveling to specific location rather than occurring anywhere when level threshold is reached. The evolution gives Crabominable ice and fighting types, despite Crabrawler being pure fighting type, with ice typing presumably coming from exposure to cold at mountain summit, suggesting that environment affects evolution outcomes in ways that genetics alone don't determine, making evolution partially environmental response rather than purely internal development controlled by DNA, expressing predetermined forms that all Crabrawler inevitably reach when properly developed. Fact 72. Nosepass always faces north due to magnetic properties orienting it toward planet's magnetic pole, creating Pokémon that cannot choose which direction to face, but is controlled by magnetic field that overrides voluntary movement. The entries describe Nosepass as Pokémon that causes problems in battles because it cannot face opponents who attack from non-northern directions, making it competitively useless due to magnetic compulsion, preventing it from turning to face threats approaching from south, east, or west, where Nosepass remains vulnerable through inability to orient toward danger without defying magnetic force that controls orientation regardless of tactical requirements. Fact 73. Sigilyph is ancient Pokémon that served as guardian for city and desert, continuing patrol route for thousands of years after city it protected was destroyed and buried by sand. The entries describe Sigilyph attacking anyone who approaches ruins of forgotten city whose inhabitants died or departed millennia ago, leaving only buried ruins and guardian Pokémon that never received orders to abandon post, continuing to protect corpse of civilization that no longer needs protecting. The loyalty creates pathos, where Sigilyph dedicates existence to pointless mission, protecting ruins that won't be harmed by travelers, who Sigilyph attacks for approaching site that holds nothing worth protecting anymore. Fact 74. Runerigus was formed when ancient spirit possessed clay tablet, inscribed with curses, creating ghost and ground type that carries cursed artifact as body part. The entries describe Runerigus absorbing people's bodies into its tablet form, turning victims into paintings on clay surface that depicts agonized faces trapped forever as two-dimensional images decorating cursed artifact that consumed their three-dimensional existence, converting physical bodies into artistic representations that Runerigus displays while searching for more victims to absorb into growing collection of trapped souls whose faces permanently Yaskes decorate tablet that became their prison after Runerigus converted them from living beings into art. Fact 75. Celesteela is Ultra Beast from another dimension that buries lower half underground, where it remains stationary, absorbing nutrients like plant, while upper half contains jets that potentially allow flight if it ever uproots itself. The entries suggest that Celesteela that arrived through ultra wormholes planted themselves, becoming permanent fixtures in locations where they landed centuries ago, with bamboo-like appearance, making them difficult to distinguish from large plants when only upper portions are visible above ground, where jet exhausts appear to be bamboo shoots to observers who don't realize they're Raidas, looking at alien spacecraft that planted itself after arriving through dimensional portal. Fact 76. Obstagoon has special move, Obstruct, that behaves like Protect, but also sharply lowers attackers' defense when blocking attacks, creating counterattack that punishes opponents for attempting to hit Obstagoon during turn when it uses signature move. The move represents Obstagoon's obstinate nature and its refusal to allow hits without retaliation, even when defending rather than attacking, turning opponent aggression against them through defense-lowering effect that makes protected Pokémon more dangerous after blocking attack that opponent wishes they hadn't attempted once, realizing that attacking defensive Obstagoon created vulnerability that didn't exist before they attacked blocked target that punished assault attempt. Fact 77. Icecue's Ice Face is literal ice block, covering its head that breaks when hit, protecting Icecue from damage, but leaving it exposed after protection shatters. The entries describe real face underneath being so adorable that it distracts opponents who become less aggressive after seeing cute face hidden beneath ice helmet that served as both protection and as mask hiding true appearance. The mechanical effect doesn't implement distraction, but flavor suggests that enemies struggle to attack cute, unmasked Icecue, whose penguin face generates sympathy. That ice-masked version didn't inspire when helmet concealed. Features that distract from battle through being disarmingly adorable. Fact 78. Morpeko switches between full belly mode and hangry mode each turn through hunger switch ability, alternating between electric and dark typing while changing personality from friendly to aggressive based on hunger that oscillates regardless of whether Morpeko actually eats. The rapid hunger cycling creates Pokémon whose mood swings are predictable by turn count, but which create personality instability, where Morpeko alternates between cheerful companion and angry creature whose short temper makes it difficult to interact with safely when knowing that contentment will transform into anger within moments, following pattern that ability mechanics determine more than actual nutritional state. Fact 79. Centiskorch generates heat exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, concentrated in body segments that glow white-hot during battles, with entries warning that victims burned by these temperatures suffer injuries that don't heal normally, requiring special treatment for burns that exceed what normal fire causes. The extreme temperature makes Centiskorch dangerous beyond typical fire-type threats, with touch potentially causing permanent scarring or tissue damage that conventional burn treatment cannot address, making this bug and fire type hazardous to approach even for fire-resistant Pokémon who can tolerate normal flames, but who cannot safely contact body parts heated beyond normal fire temperatures into range where metal melts and biological tissue vaporizes instantly. Fact 80. Dracovish combines fish and dinosaur, creating impossible chimera that entries describe as struggling to function because evolution combined parts that don't belong together, making species that shouldn't exist. The entries describe Dracovish's difficulty breathing and moving due to incompatible body plan, where aquatic tail and predatory head don't cooperate efficiently, creating creature that suffers from its own existence as forced combination of fossil parts that scientists revived without checking whether pieces came from same species, accidentally creating hybrid that neither fossil species would recognize as descendant, and that suffers design flaws from mismatched anatomy that wouldn't survive naturally, but which human intervention allowed to exist despite biological issues that combination created. And so concludes the second part of our weird Pokemon facts journey, having explored more biological impossibilities like Wailord's impossible density, more disturbing behaviors like Malamar's potential world domination, more evolutionary oddities like Crabrawler requiring specific locations to evolve, and more dark implications like Runerigus absorbing victims into paintings. Rest now if sleep calls, or continue to part 3, where we'll discover the final 40 weird facts about Pokemon, including bizarre game mechanics, strange regional variants, peculiar, legendary behaviors, and the ultimate strange truths about the Pokemon world. Sleep gently, dear friends. Welcome back, dear friends, to the final part of our exploration of Pokemon's strangest facts. In this concluding section, we'll examine bizarre game mechanics that make no logical sense, uncover mysteries that Game Freak never explained, explore weird regional variants whose transformations defy biological explanation, investigate legendary Pokemon whose existence creates more questions than answers, discover strange competitive quirks that shouldn't work but do, and conclude with the ultimate weird truths about Pokemon that reveal just how bizarre this beloved franchise truly is beneath its cheerful exterior. So settle back one final time, close your eyes whenever sleep beckons, and let us complete this gentle journey through the weirdness that makes Pokemon endlessly fascinating. Fact 81. Pokemon can be stored as digital data in PC storage system that holds theoretically unlimited creatures in computer database, converting living beings into information that can be uploaded, downloaded, and transferred without any explanation for how consciousness survives digitization or how biological matter becomes computer data. The technology implications are staggering, suggesting that Pokemon World has mastered matter-energy conversion and consciousness digitization far beyond what real science can achieve. Yet this revolutionary technology is used exclusively for storing battle creatures rather than for applications that would transform civilization, like eliminating hunger through food replication or achieving immortality through consciousness backup. Fact 82. Shiny Pokemon appear randomly with odds of approximately 1 inch, 4,096 inches modern games, creating rare color variants whose only difference from normal specimens is appearance without in-universe explanation for why alternate colorations exist. The game mechanic treats shininess as genetic trait that breeding can influence, but Pokédex entries never acknowledge that color variants exist, making shininess purely mechanical feature without narrative justification for why some Pokémon are differently colored than others of their number peak species, whether different colors affect behavior or abilities that lore doesn't describe, or whether shininess has significance beyond being collectible variant that players seek for prestige. Fact 83. Pokemon centers heal all injuries completely and instantly for free, using machines whose technology apparently can cure any injury, any disease, and even death through revival from fainting. Yet this miracle technology isn't applied to humans who suffer illnesses and injuries that Pokemon Center machines could theoretically cure if healing technology worked on humans the way it works on Pokemonday. The selective application of healing technology suggests either that Pokemon biology differs so fundamentally from human biology that same machines can't treat both, or that society restricts miracle healing to Pokemon for economic or political reasons that games don't explore beyond establishing that healthcare is free for Pokemon but presumably isn't free for humans. Fact 84. Eggs appear at daycare when Pokemon breed, but nobody witnesses breeding occurring or sees eggs being laid, with daycare man expressing surprise at finding eggs, despite being responsible for watching Pokemon whose reproductive behavior apparently happens when nobody's looking. The mysterious egg appearance without observation of breeding process or laying creates ambiguity about what actually occurs at daycare, whether Pokemon physically reproduce or whether eggs manifest through unknown mechanism that caretakers don't understand, but which reliably produces eggs from compatible pairs kept together long enough for mysterious process to complete, creating eggs that nobody sees appearing. Fact 85. Legendary Pokemon can be caught and stored in Pokeballs despite being gods or embodiments of cosmic forces whose capture by ordinary trainers using mass-produced technology seems to contradict their status as unique, powerful entities. The mechanics allow catching Dialga, Palkia, Arceus, and other creation deities without explaining how plastic spheres contain beings who created time, space, and reality itself, or why godlike entities permit themselves to be captured and commanded by children who just happen to weaken them sufficiently that Pokeball technology could imprison creatures whose power should exceed what Kraz containment technology can handle regardless of damage inflicted before capture attempt. Fact 86. Alolan forms are regional variants, explained as environmental adaptation occurring over time, but Galarian forms evolved in completely different directions from same ancestral species, suggesting that environment determines evolution outcomes more than genetics do. When separated populations of single species develop into dramatically different forms depending on region, the rapid regional divergence conflicts with real evolution's timescales, where developing distinct adaptations requires millions of years that Alolan and Galarian forms apparently didn't need for evolving dramatic differences, including type changes and complete behavioral alterations that occurred in timeframes far too short for conventional evolution, explaining observed variations. Fact 87. Pokemon understand human speech perfectly, despite being different species who should require translation, with Pokemon comprehending complex commands, understanding strategy discussions, and responding appropriately to verbal instructions without anyone questioning how cross-species communication works flawlessly without language barriers. Some Pokemon can even speak human languages through telepathy or through learning speech, making communication bidirectional, though most Pokemon only communicate through species-specific cries that trainers somehow understand, despite cries being simple sounds without obvious linguistic structure that would allow conveying complex meanings that Pokemon apparently can express through vocalizations that trainers interpret accurately. Fact 88. Fossils can be revived into living Pokemon using technology that reconstructs ancient creatures from genetic material preserved in stones millions of years old. But revived fossils are always rock type, regardless of whether living versions would have been rock type, creating question about whether rock typing is artifact of revival process or whether fossilization changed their type. The revival technology works perfectly despite DNA degradation that would make ancient genetic material unusable for cloning through conventional biotechnology, suggesting that fossil revival uses unknown techniques that reconstruct creatures from fragmentary information through processes that games show but never explain mechanically. Fact 89. Type effectiveness creates situations where small flames from Charmander can defeat massive ocean-dwelling Wailord through type advantage, mattering more than size, weight, or logical power differences that realistic combat would create when tiny fire lizard fights enormous whale. The abstract battle system prioritizes types over realistic physics, making matches that shouldn't be competitive into balanced fights through mechanics that ignore massive size and power disparities in favor of type relationships that determine outcomes regardless of whether small fire could realistically threaten creature that could swallow Charmander whole without noticing it was there. Fact 90. HMs created permanent moves that couldn't be forgotten without move deleters' help, trapping Pokemon with field moves that wasted battle move slots, making them weaker than they should be because game design required specific moves for overworld navigation. The frustrating mechanic forced players to include HM users whose battle effectiveness was compromised by having Surf, Strength, Cut, or other navigation moves that weren't optimal battle choices, occupying slots that better attacks could use if HM system allowed for getting moves, or if field navigation didn't require move slots that reduced combat effectiveness. Of Pokemon serving utility roles. Fact 91. Pokemon, Amy, and similar friendship mechanics allowed petting and feeding Pokemon using touchscreen, creating interactions that sometimes felt uncomfortable when adult players petted humanoid Pokemon whose designs or behaviors created ambiguous relationships between trainer and creature. The affection system provided gameplay benefits, including experience, boosts, and survival chances through Pokemon, randomly avoiding attacks or surviving hits that should knock them out because affection somehow translates into combat. Advantages that create mechanical incentives for maximizing friendship through petting and feeding that increase effectiveness beyond just making Pokemon happy for emotional satisfaction. Fact 92. Giratina was banished to Distortion World for violence, according to mythology that doesn't specify what violence warranted eternal dimensional imprisonment, away from normal reality where Dialga and Palkia remain while their excessivation. Antimatter counterpart exists in realm where physics operates differently. The myth suggests that Arceus punished Giratina for crimes that entries don't describe, leaving ambiguous whether banishment was justified or tyrannical, whether Giratina repented or remains dangerous, and whether dimensional prison is punishment or protective containment, preventing Giratina's presence from contaminating normal reality through antimatter properties that might destroy matter if Giratina existed permanently outside. Distortion World. Fact 93. Mega evolution causes pain to some Pokémon, according to Pokédex entries describing Mega Garchomp's suffering or Mega Absol's stress during transformation, creating ethical concerns about temporary pain, evolution mechanic that increases power at cost of Pokémon well-being. The entries describe melting flesh, overwhelming power causing suffering, or rage from transformation, suggesting that mega evolution isn't always beneficial experience for Pokémon who undergo it, even though trainers use mechanic without hesitation or apparent concern for discomfort that entries describe as accompanying transformations that games treat as purely positive power boosts, without acknowledging suffering that lore occasionally mentions as side effect of forced evolution. Fact 94. Necrozma steals light from entire dimensions, leaving them in eternal darkness according to Ultra Sun and Moon plot, where this psychic type drained Ultra Megalopolis of illumination, condemning civilization to perpetual night. The light stealing creates apocalyptic scenario where Necrozma's feeding devastates worlds through removing fundamental resource that life depends on, making Necrozma not just powerful legendary, but existential threat, whose appetite consumes dimensions light, leaving dead worlds behind after Necrozma moves on, seeking new light sources to drain from universes that cannot defend. Against Prism Pokemon's insatiable hunger, Fact Quatrevenkins, Dynamax energy comes from Eternatus's presence in Galar, creating phenomenon where Pokémon temporarily grow to enormous sizes through absorbing radiation that shouldn't cause size changes, but which Pokémon physics allows despite violating square cube law and other physical constraints that would make giant organisms collapse under own weight. The temporary gigantification doesn't explain where additional mass comes from or where it goes after Dynamax ends, whether Pokémon actually grow or appear larger through illusion, or how structures withstand battles between kaiju-sized creatures whose attacks should devastate stadiums that somehow survive impacts from building-sized Pokémon using moves enhanced by Dynamax that multiplies their power. Fact Kilentevenhat, Pokerus is beneficial virus that doubles EV gains, creating positive disease that competitive players deliberately spread between Pokémon through keeping infected specimens in party with uninfected teammates who catch Pokerus from contact. The virus is rarer than shinies, making it extremely unlikely to encounter naturally, but once obtained can be maintained indefinitely through PC storage, preventing cure that occurs when infected Pokémon remains in party for several days, creating situation where players manage disease like resource, preventing recovery to maintain infection's benefits, that competitive battling values, despite being disease that technically afflicts Pokémon, even though effects are purely positive. Fact 97. Fairy type was introduced in Generation 6, changing Dragon type's dominance through creating immunity that dragons couldn't bypass, retroactively changing numerous existing Pokemon's types, including making Clefairy line into fairy types, rather than normal types they had been for previous 4 generations. The type addition rewrote decades of established lore and mechanics, creating situation where Pokemon's fundamental nature changed through developer decision to rebalance competitive metagame, demonstrating that types aren't immutable characteristics, but are design choices that Game Freak can alter when balance requires adjustments that improve gameplay, even when changes contradict established characterizations or previously canonical type designations. Fact 98. Shadow Pokémon in Colosseum and XD have hearts artificially closed, creating creatures that feel no emotion and attack ruthlessly without mercy or restraint until purification reopens hearts, allowing feelings to return. The artificial emotional suppression creates disturbing weapon program where deliberate cruelty transforms Pokémon into mindless attack machines whose suffering is tool for creating stronger fighters who don't hesitate or show mercy that normal Pokémon might display when emotional responses create reluctance to continue fighting opponents who are defeated or suffering, making shadow Pokémon perfect weapons through removing compassion that would limit their effectiveness. Fact 99. Substitute creates decoy using 1/4 of user's HP, creating copy that absorbs attacks while hiding real Pokémon behind dummy, but mechanism isn't explained, leaving unclear whether substitute is illusion, solid construct, or something else that can be touched and damaged, absorbing physical attacks directed at it. The HP cost suggests that substitute is created from user's life force or biological matter carved from body to create separate entity that takes damage independently before breaking after absorbing sufficient punishment, though visualizations show substitute as doll-like figure without biological characteristics, suggesting its magical construct rather than flesh copy. Fact 100. Arceus created universe according to mythology and is considered Pokémon god, despite being catchable creature that can be knocked out by Rattata if sufficiently weakened, creating theological paradox where omnipotent creator deity can be defeated and captured by ordinary trainers using conventional battle tactics. The mythology describes Arceus emerging from cosmic egg before anything else existed and creating reality through its powers, but gameplay treats it as extremely powerful Pokémon rather than as invincible god, creating disconnect between lore, describing omnipotence, and mechanics, allowing children to capture creator in plastic ball after weakening it with attacks that shouldn't affect being who made existence. Fact 101. Meltan and Melmetal exist exclusively in Pokémon Go before being transferable to main series games, creating species that cannot be encountered or obtained through traditional gameplay but only through mobile app integration. The mysterious steel types are formed when multiple Meltan merge together with entries describing them as previously unknown species that ancient texts mentioned but which modern researchers hadn't encountered until recently, suggesting that these Pokémon were hidden or extinct before reappearing through circumstances that games don't explain beyond showing that Meltan appeared and could evolve when sufficient numbers merged into Melmetal. Fact 102. Wonder Trade randomly exchanges Pokémon with strangers worldwide, creating lottery where players might receive rare Pokémon or might receive common early game species, creating entirely luck-based trading that removes negotiation from exchange. The feature encouraged players to send interesting Pokémon, hoping to receive equivalent value, but many players used Wonder Trade for disposing of unwanted breeding, rejects flooding system with common Pokémon that recipients didn't want, creating frustration when Wonder Trade yielded disappointment rather than wonder, despite feature's optimistic name, suggesting positive experiences that random trading occasionally provided but frequently failed to deliver when most trades yielded trash. Fact 103. Rotation battles allowed switching between 3 active Pokémon without using turn, creating format where prediction mattered more than raw power, through anticipating which Pokémon opponent would rotate into active position and selecting moves accordingly. The format appeared in Generation V but was removed in later generations, making it orphaned battle style that existed briefly before being discontinued, suggesting that rotation battles weren't popular enough to maintain despite creating unique strategic scenarios that standard formats didn't replicate through rotation mechanic that three Pokemon simultaneous play created when combined with instant switching that turn economy normally prevents through requiring turn expenditure for switching between party members. Fact 104. Triple battles featured three Pokemon per side fighting simultaneously with positioning mattering because some moves could only target adjacent positions, creating spatial tactics that single and double battles didn't require. Like rotation battles, triple battles were removed in later generations, making them historical curiosity that briefly existed before being abandoned, suggesting that complex multi-Pokemon formats didn't resonate with audiences who preferred simpler double battles or traditional singles that don't require tracking three positions and considering spatial relationships that triple battles emphasized through mechanics that made battlefield position strategically relevant in ways that other formats ignored. Fact 105. Sky battles restricted participation to flying types and Pokemon with levitate ability, creating specialized format where only airborne Pokemon could participate, but format was discontinued after Generation VI, making it shortest-lived battle format that existed in only single generation. The aerial restriction created type-limited metagame where sky battles tested flying type knowledge specifically, but limited participation pool apparently made format unpopular with players who couldn't use most their Pokemon in battles that excluded non-flying species, creating barrier that prevented casual engagement with format that competitive flying type specialists might have enjoyed, but which general audiences found too restrictive. Fact 106. Inverse battles reverse type effectiveness, making weaknesses into resistances and resistances into weaknesses, creating completely inverted metagame where everything players knew about type matchups became backwards. The format appeared as repeatable challenge battle in Generation VI, but wasn't integrated into competitive play, making it novelty that tested adaptability to reversed type relationships that experienced players found disorienting. Through contradicting decades of learned type knowledge that inverse battles deliberately subverted, creating scenario where expertise became liability through instincts suggesting wrong choices when effectiveness, relationships inverted, making strong players temporarily weak through confusion that inverse effectiveness created. Fact 107. Gym leader castle in stadium games allowed playing as gym leaders with their rental teams, creating opportunity to experience battles from opponent perspective using specialized teams that gym leaders commanded. But feature wasn't continued in later stadium-style games, making it unique mode that briefly let players inhabit roles that main series relegated to NPCs, whose teams players could temporarily command before feature was discontinued in formats that focused on players' Pokemon rather than on providing opportunities to use preset teams representing characters from main series games that Stadium integrated into challenge modes. Fact 108. Origin Forme Giratina cannot exist outside Distortion World without Griseous Orb, held item maintaining its true form in normal dimension, where physics would otherwise force altered form as compromise between Giratina's full power and what reality can contain. The form restriction suggests that Giratina's true nature is incompatible with normal space, requiring either dimensional anchoring through Griseous Orb or physical transformation into altered form that sacrifices some power for stability, that allows existing in dimension, that rejects origin, forms properties without external stabilization that orb provides through unknown mechanisms. Fact 109. Pokemon contests judged appeal rather than battle, prowess creating alternative progression path, where combat was irrelevant compared to aesthetic performance, but contests were removed in several generations, making them inconsistent feature that appeared, disappeared, and sometimes returned depending on generation, creating discontinuity, where some regions featured contests while others ignored performance competition, entirely suggesting that contests aren't universal cultural practice but are regional traditions that some areas maintain while others focus exclusively on battling without alternative paths for trainers whose interests lie in performance rather than combat. Fact 110. Secret bases allowed decorating personal spaces that other players could visit through wireless connectivity or QR codes sharing base locations, but feature was generation specific, appearing in Generation 3 and Generation 6, but not in others, making it inconsistent element that some regions supported, while others lacked underground or equivalent spaces where bases could exist. The customization provided creative expression without affecting gameplay, substantially making bases purely cosmetic feature that devoted players enjoyed decorating while others ignored completely, suggesting that bases appealed to specific audiences interested in housing rather than having universal appeal, warranting inclusion in every generation. Fact 111. Following, Pokémon walked behind trainer in Overworld in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, creating visible companion whose presence made starter or favorite Pokémon feel like actual companion traveling together rather than existing only in abstract party menu, but feature was absent from most other games, despite being extremely popular with players who wanted persistent Pokémon presence that following mechanics provided through showing lead Pokémon accompanying trainer visually instead of remaining invisible until summoned for battle, creating disconnect between being together and never seeing partner except during fights. Fact 112. Pokeathlon in Heart Gold and Soul Silver featured Olympic-style competitions, testing speed, power, skill, stamina, and jump, creating athletic contests separate from battling, but minigame compilation wasn't featured in other generations, making it unique HGSS element that briefly existed before being replaced with different minigames in subsequent generations. The athletic focus created scenarios where battle-weak Pokémon could excel through having stats suited for specific Pokeathlon events, even when combat applications were limited, providing alternative contexts where different characteristics mattered beyond just battle effectiveness that traditional gameplay emphasized almost exclusively. Fact 113. Pokémon Ami and Pokémon Refresh allowed cleaning Pokémon after battle and curing status conditions through wiping touchscreen, simulating washing, or treating partner, but care mechanics were inconsistent across generations, appearing with variations in some games while being absent or drastically changed in others, creating discontinuity where relationship mechanics differed depending on generation. The care features provided bonding opportunities through simulated physical interaction but weren't maintained consistently, suggesting that Game Freak experimented with relationship systems without settling on definitive mechanics that would persist across generations as standard features. Fact 114. Soaring on Latios or Latias in Omega, Ruby, and Alpha Sapphire allowed free flight across Hoenn, creating exploration mechanic, where entire region was visible from above, and where flying directly to any location was possible, but feature wasn't implemented in other games, despite being popular with players who enjoyed aerial exploration that normal fly's teleportation didn't provide, through showing actual travel between locations instead of instant arrival that traditional fly created without journey. That soaring featured through showing traversal across landscape that players could control freely rather than just selecting destinations from menu. Fact 115. Riding Pokemon in Sun, Moon, Ultra Sun, and Ultra Moon replaced HMs with context-sensitive ride Pokémon that appeared when needed without occupying party slots, but ride system was generation-specific, being replaced in Sword and Shield, with different mechanics showing that Game Freak continued experimenting with field navigation without maintaining consistent system across teen generations, despite ride Pokemon successfully solving HM problems that had plagued series for decades before Alola introduced alternative that later games abandoned in favor of other solutions. Fact 116. Pokemon Camp in Sword and Shield allowed cooking curry and playing with team, creating bonding activities that provided experience and friendship boosts. But Camp replaced previous caring mechanics with different mini-games, showing continued iteration on relationship systems that kept changing across generations, preventing players from mastering any single system before it was replaced. The curry cooking featured hundreds of recipes, encouraging experimentation with ingredient combinations, while playing with Pokemon used motion controls for toy interactions that provided entertainment alongside mechanical benefits. That people encouraged regular camp visits for maximizing team effectiveness through grinding friendship and experience. Fact 117. Picnics in Scarlet and Violet continued camping tradition, with sandwiches replacing curry while adding egg-finding mechanic, where breeding now occurs during picnics rather than at daycare, creating change where players control breeding. Through preparing sandwiches and waiting for eggs to appear in picnic basket rather than depositing pairs at daycare and returning later. The sandwich crafting features elaborate physics where ingredients must be stacked carefully, preventing toppling, while creating specific effects based on combinations that provide buffs for encounters, egg finding, or other benefits depending on recipe used. Fact 118. Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee integrated Pokemon Go mechanics into main series through implementing throwing mechanics with motion controls or touchscreen for catching wild Pokemon without battle, creating controversial departure from traditional catching that required weakening targets before attempting capture. The Go-style catching removed wild battles, making encounters simpler but less engaging for players who valued traditional format, where preparation and strategy mattered for catching difficult Pokemon, whose removal of battle element made catching passive rather than active gameplay. That traditional system created through requiring combat before capture attempts. Fact 119. Paradox Pokemon in Scarlet and Violet appear to be ancient or future relatives of existing species, but don't evolve and cannot breed, creating mystery about whether they're actually past and future versions, or whether there's something else entirely that coincidentally resembles other Pokemon's ancestors or descendants. The Scarlet Book and Violet Book describe these Pokemon but acknowledge that descriptions might be fantasy rather than fact, leaving ambiguous whether paradox species are genuine time-displaced creatures or are creations from Professor's imagination made real through terrestrial phenomenon that allows impossible things to manifest when belief and energy combine in ways that shouldn't work but do. Fact 120. Pokemon ultimately makes no sense when examined closely with biology that contradicts physics, psychology that ignores consciousness, questions, society that doesn't logically follow from having captured technology and monster battles, mythology that conflicts with gameplay, and lore that contradicts itself across games and generations, yet despite incoherence, Pokemon remains beloved franchise precisely because it doesn't make sense, because its weirdness creates mystery and discussion and interpretation, where definitive answers would close exploration, that ambiguity keeps open, allowing fans to theorize, debate, and imagine explanations for bizarre world where children leave home to capture creatures who might be gods, ghosts, or garbage that achieved sentience through mechanisms that nobody understands, because Pokemon asks audiences to accept impossibilities without explanation and to focus on adventure and friendship rather than on making franchise make sense through conventional logic that Pokemon deliberately ignores in favor of whimsy, wonder, and weirdness that makes franchise special precisely through refusing to explain itself in ways that would eliminate strangeness that makes Pokemon endlessly fascinating. And so we conclude our comprehensive journey through 120 weird Pokemon facts, having explored biological impossibilities that violate physics, disturbing Pokédex entries that describe horrors hidden in child-friendly franchise, evolutionary oddities that make no genetic sense, game mechanics that create paradoxes, regional variants that shouldn't develop so quickly, legendary Pokémon whose capture contradicts their godhood, discontinued features that briefly existed before vanishing, and ultimately the fundamental strangeness of franchise that refuses to make complete sense according to rules that normal fiction follows, when building consistent worlds that internal logic governs rather than embracing incoherence that Pokemon somehow makes work through charm and nostalgia that overcome logical complaints about franchise whose weirdness is feature rather than flaw. Pokemon's enduring appeal comes partly from these weird facts that spark conversations and theories about what's really happening in a world where 10-year-olds travel alone collecting creatures who might be deceased, humans transformed into ghosts, where pocket-sized devices contain beings whose masses exceed building weights, where type advantages matter more than realistic power differences, allowing tiny creatures to defeat colossal monsters, where death creates ghost types rather than ending consciousness, where technology enables digitizing living beings without destroying their minds, and where gods permit capture by ordinary trainers using mass-produced balls that theoretically shouldn't contain divine beings who created time and space itself, but which somehow work regardless of power differentials that should prevent containment. The weirdness creates space for imagination, where official answers don't exist, allowing fans to develop theories explaining oddities that Game Freak never intended to explain through treating mysteries as features rather than as oversights requiring correction. The theories about Ditto being failed Mew clones, about humans becoming Pokemon through transformation or possession, about whether Pokemon World is post-apocalyptic future, where humans created creatures as weapons or companions, about what Diglett looks like underground, about whether Ash is still 10 because he's comatose or because time works differently, about whether Pokemon storage kills and recreates creatures through destructive digitization. These theories emerge from weirdness that canon doesn't adequately address, creating vacuum where speculation fills gaps, that official lore leaves empty through incompleteness or contradiction. The franchise's willingness to add mechanics, change types, retcon lore, discontinue features, and generally not worry about consistency across 3 decades and 9 generations demonstrates that Game Freak prioritizes innovation and accessibility over maintaining rigid continuity that would prevent experimentation, requiring explaining how changes fit into established framework. The fluid approach allows trying ideas like Mega Evolution, Z moves, Dynamax, and terrestrialization without needing to justify why different regions have different mechanics or how new phenomena integrate with previous systems beyond just showing that they exist now, creating succession of temporary mechanics that they appear, dominate single generation, then vanish when next generation introduces replacement without explaining why abandoned mechanics stopped functioning when regions change. This flexibility keeps franchise fresh through constantly adding new elements, preventing stagnation that strict adherence to established rules might create if Game Freak felt obligated to maintain every feature and explain every change through narrative justification, rather than just implementing whatever seems interesting for current generation, without concerning themselves with how additions affect overall coherence of world that prioritizes moment-to-moment gameplay over maintaining logical consistency across decades of releases that different teams developed with varying priorities, creating patchwork of ideas that somehow coheres into beloved franchise despite or because of incoherence that makes Pokémon weird, wonderful, and endlessly discussable. Sleep now, dear friends. Having completed this exhaustive exploration of Pokémon's weirdness that reveals how strange this franchise truly is, beneath cheerful surface that conceals dark Pokédex entries, impossible biology, discontinued features, contradictory lore, and fundamental questions about consciousness, death, identity, and reality that games raise without answering, leaving players to wonder about mysteries that Pokémon contains within seemingly simple games about collecting creatures and battling with friends, creating depth through ambiguity that definitive explanations would eliminate, making weirdness essential quality rather than problematic flaw, requiring correction through retcons or explanations that would reduce mystery into mundane details that imagination makes more interesting through allowing unlimited interpretation. May your dreams be filled with Pokémon whose true natures remain mysterious, whose biologies defy explanation, whose behaviors disturb and fascinate, and whose existence proves that not everything needs making sense for mattering to people who love these creatures, despite their impossibilities and incoherencies, and all the weird facts that make Pokémon simultaneously incomprehensible and irreplaceable. Thank you for accompanying this journey through Pokémon's weirdness, from biological impossibilities, through disturbing implications, through mechanical oddities, through ultimate strangeness that permeates franchise, making it special precisely through refusing to make complete sense, but instead embracing mystery, contradiction, and whimsy that create space where imagination flourishes beyond what complete explanations would permit if franchise prioritized coherence over wonder. Rest peacefully knowing that Pokémon's weirdness is feature worth celebrating rather than flaw requiring fixing, that mysteries are more interesting than answers would be, that inconsistencies create discussion rather than creating problems, and that franchise's willingness to not make complete sense, paradoxically makes perfect sense for games whose appeal comes partly from refusing to fully explain themselves, leaving room for players to fill gaps with theories and interpretations that official canon doesn't foreclose through providing definitive answers that would end speculation, making Pokemon less interesting than ambiguity maintains by keeping mysteries alive across decades. That new discoveries about old games continue revealing weird details that players didn't notice during childhoods, spent enjoying games without analyzing them as deeply as adult fans who discover strangeness that always existed waiting for in recognition. Sweet dreams of weird Pokemon whose oddities make them fascinating rather than off-putting, whose impossible biologies create wonder rather than confusion, whose disturbing entries add depth rather than undermining innocence, and whose mysteries invite exploration rather than demanding answers that games wisely refuse to provide, leaving strangeness intact for players to appreciate across lifetimes spent with franchise that never stops being weird and wonderful and worthy of examination, that reveals new peculiarities with each investigation into depths that surface simplicity conceals, from casual observation that careful analysis exposes as containing multitudes of oddities, making Pokemon infinitely weird and infinitely rewarding for those who look closely enough to see strangeness hiding in plain sight. Good night, dear trainers. Sleep gently knowing that Pokemon will forever remain beautifully, perfectly, inexplicably weird in ways that make it special beyond what completely logical franchise could achieve, through embracing oddity as strength rather than treating it as weakness requiring correction. May your dreams be strange as Pokemon's world, where anything is possible precisely because nothing needs making sense according to normal rules that this franchise joyfully ignores in favor of creating experiences where wonder matters more than logic, and where weirdness becomes reason for loving rather than reason for leaving. Franchise that captured hearts through being delightfully, unapologetically, magnificently weird across 30 years of refusing to explain itself completely, while inviting exploration of mysteries that full explanations would destroy, through eliminating ambiguity that speculation requires for flourishing beyond boundaries that canonical answers would impose upon imagination. That Pokemon's intentional and unintentional weirdness liberates from constraints that normal fiction obeys, but which Pokemon gleefully transcends. Sleep well in knowledge that weird is wonderful. Good night forever, dear friends who appreciate strangeness. Until we meet again in dreams or in daylight, where Pokemon's weirdness awaits rediscovery. Sweet dreams of beautiful impossibilities. Rest peacefully among mysteries. Good night.